Okay, Assalamu alaikum. We are starting to in part two of chapter four, cultural traditions of classical India, reading from Strayer's Ways of the World. Um, like I said, page 174. Cultural traditions of classical India. The cultural development of Indian civilization was far different from that of China, whereas Confucianism paid little attention to the gods, spirits, and speculation of religious matters. Indian elite culture embraced the divine and all things spiritual with enthusiasm and generated elaborate philosophical visions about the nature of ultimate reality. But the Indian religious tradition, later called Hinduism, differed from other world religions as well. Like Buddhism, Christianity, or Islam, Hinduism had no historical founder. Rather, it grew up over many centuries along with Indian civilization. Although it later spread into Southeast Asia, Hinduism was not a missionary religion seeking converts, but was, like Judaism, associated with a particular people or territory. In fact, Hinduism was never a single tradition at all, and the term itself derives from outsiders, Greek Muslims and later the British, who sought to reduce the infinite variety of Indian cultural patterns into a recognizable system. From the inside, however, Hinduism dissolved into a vast diversity of gods, spirits, beliefs, practices, rituals, and philosophies. This ended uh, variegated Hinduism served to incorporate into Indian civilizations the many diverse peoples who migrated into or invaded the South Asian peninsula over many centuries and several millennia. Its ability to accommodate this diversity gave India's culture and development a distinctive quality. South Asia religion, from ritual sacrifice to philosophical speculation. Despite the fragmentation and variety of Indian culture and religious patterns, an evolving set of widely recognized sacred texts provided many commonalities. The earliest text, known as the Vedas, was a collection of poems and hymns, prayers, and rituals compiled by priests called Brahmins. The Vedas were for centuries transmitted orally and were reduced to writing in Sanskrit around 600 BCE. In the Vedas, historians have caught have caught fleeting glimpses of Indian civilization in its formative centuries. Those sacred writings tell of small competitive chiefdoms or kingdoms, of, sac- of sacred sounds and fires, of numerous gods rising and falling in importance over the centuries. It also suggests a clearly patriarchal society, but one that affords upper class women somewhat greater opportunity than they later enjoyed. Vedic women participated in religious sacrifices, sometimes engaging in scholarship and religious debate, were always to wear the sacred thread that symbolized spiritual purity in the higher caste, and would on occasion marry a woman of their own choosing. The Vedas describe as the the elaborate ritual sacrifice that Brahmin priests required. Performing these sacrifices and rituals with great precision enabled the Brahmins to acquire numerous power and wealth, sometimes exceeding that of kings and warriors. But Brahmins also generated growing criticism. A ritual became mechanical and informal, and the Brahmins required heavy fees to perform them. In this dissatisfaction arose another body of sacred texts, the Upanishads, composed of largely anonymous thinkers between 800 and 400 BCE. These were mystical and highly philosophical works that sought to probe the inner meanings of the sacrifices prescribed in the Vedas. In the in the Upanishads, external ritual gave way to introspective thinking, which expressed in many in varied formulas of central concepts of philosophical Hinduism that have persisted into modern times. Chief among them was the idea of Brahman, the world soul, the final and ultimate reality. Beyond the multiplicity of material objects and individual persons, and beyond even the various gods themselves, lay this primal, unitary energy or divine reality, infusing all things similar in some way to the Chinese notion of the Tao. This alone was real. The immense diversity of existence with human beings perceived with their sense was an illusion. The fundamental assertion of philosophical Hinduism is that the individual human soul, or Atman, was in fact a part of Brahman. Beyond the quest of pleasure, wealth, power, and social position, all of which were perfectly normal and quite legitimate, lay the effort to achieve the final goal of humankind, union with Brahman, an end to our illusory perception of a separate existence. This was moksha, or liberation, compared sometimes with a bubbling in the glass of water, breaking through the surface and becoming one with the surrounding atmosphere. Achieving this exalted state was held to involve many lifetimes as a notion of samsara, or rebirth, reincarnation, became a central feature in Hindu thinking. Human souls migrated from body to body over many lifetimes, depending on one's actions. It was the law of karma. Pure actions appropriate to one's station in life resulted in rebirth or a higher social position or class, caste. Thus, the caste system of distinction and rank groups, each with its own duties, became a register of spiritual progress. Birth in the higher caste was evidence of good karma based on actions in the previous life and offered a better chance to achieve moksha, which brought with it an end to painful cycle of rebirth. If Hinduism underpinned caste, it also legitimated and expressed Indian gender system. In South Asian civilization crystallized under the second wave civilization, its patriarchal features tightened. Women were increasingly seen as unclean below the navel, forbidden to learn the Vedas, and excluded from public religion rituals. The laws of Manu, composed probably in the early CE centuries, described a divinely ordained social order and articulated a gender system whose ideals endure for a millennia more. It taught that all embryos were basically male and that only weak semen generated female babies. It advocated child marriage for girls to men far older than themselves. A virtuous wife, the law proclaimed, should consistently serve her husband like a god and should never remarry after his death. In a famous prescription similar to that of Chinese and other patriarchal societies, the law declared if in childhood a female must be subject to her father, in youth to her husband, when her lord is dead to her sons, a woman must never be independent. And yet, some aspect of Hinduism served to empower women. Sexual pleasure was considered a legitimate goal for both men and women, and its techniques was derived in the Kama Sutra. Many Hindu deities were female, some giving life-giving and faithful like others like Kali, fiercely destructive. Women were particularly prominent in the growing devotional culture dedicated to culture deities, where neither gender nor caste were obstacles for spiritual fulfillment. A further feature of Hindu religious thought lay in its provision of different paths of ultimate goal of liberation or moksha. Various ways of this final release, appropriate to people of different temperaments, were spelled out in the Hindu teachings. Some might achieve moksha through knowledge or study, others by means of detaching actions in the world, doing one's work without regards of consequences. Still others through passionate devotion to some deity or through extended meditation practice. Such ideas carried by Brahmin priests and even more by wandering ascetics who had withdrawn from ordinary life in pursuit of their spiritual development became widely known throughout India. The Buddhist challenge. At the same time, a philosophical Hinduism was emerging. Another movement took shape as soon as and soon became a distinct and separate religious tradition, Buddhism. Unlike Hinduism, this new faith had a historical founder, Siddhartha Gautama, a prince from a small North Indian state. According to Buddhist tradition, the prince had enjoyed a shelter of delightful youth and was shocked to his core upon encountering old age, sickness, and death. Leaving family and fortune behind, he then set out on a 6-year spiritual quest, finally achieving insight or enlightenment at the age of 35. For the rest of his life, he taught that what he had learned and gathered a small but growing community. Those members were to see him as the Buddha, the enlightened one, a human being who has awakened. I teach but one thing, the Buddha said, suffering and the end of suffering. To the Buddha, suffering or sorrow experiencing life was imperfect, impertinent, and unsatisfactory, was the central and universal feature of human life. It, its cause was desire or craving for individual fulfillment, attachment to what which to that which inevitably changes, particular to the notion of a core self or ego that is uniquely and solidly me. The cure of this disease lay in living a modest and moral life combined with meditation practice. Those who follow the Buddhist path most fully could expect to achieve enlightenment or nirvana by virtually prescribing states in indescribable states in which individual identity would be extinguished along with all greed, hatred, and delusion. With the pain, with the pain of unnecessary suffering finally ended, the enlightened person would experience an overwhelming serenity, even in the midst of difficulty, as well as an immense loving kindness or passion for all beings. It was simple. It was a simple message, elaborately endlessly, and a various form of those who followed him. Much of the Buddhist teachings reflected the Hindu tradition from which it sprang. The idea that the ordinary life is an illusion, the concept of karma and rebirth, the goal of overcoming the incessant demands of the ego, the practice of meditation, the hope of final release from the cycle of rebirth. All of these Hindu elements found their way into Buddhist teaching. In this respect, Buddhism was a simplified and more accessible version of Hinduism. Other elements of Buddhism teaching, however, sharply challenged prevailing Hindu thinking, rejecting the religious authority of the Brahmins. The Buddha ridiculed their rituals and sacrifices as irrelevant to the hard work of dealing with one's suffering. Nor was he much interested in abstract speculation about the creation of the world or the existence of God. For such questions, he declared, are not useful in the quest of holiness. They do not lead to peace and to the direct knowledge of nirvana. Individuals who had take responsibility for their own spiritual actions with no help from human authorities or supernatural beings, it was a religious of intense self-effort based on personal experience. The Buddha also challenged the inequalities of the Hindu-based caste system, arguing that neither caste, position, nor gender was a barrier to enlightenment. The possibility of awakening was available to all. But when it came to establishing a formal organization of the Buddhist most devoted followers, the prevailing patriarchy of Indian society made itself felt. Buddhism's texts recount that the Buddha's foster mother, Pajapati Gautami, sought to enter the newly created order of monks, but was repeatedly refused admission by the Buddha himself. Only after the intervention of the Buddha's attendants, Anandi, did he relent and allow women to join a separate order of nuns. Even then, these nuns were subjected to a series of rules that clearly subordinated them to men. Male monks, for example, could officially admonish the nuns, but the reverse was forbidden. Here is a reflection of a particular strain of Buddhism thinking that viewed women as a distracting obstacle to male enlightenment. Nonetheless, thousands of women flocked to join Buddhism order of nuns, where they found a degree of freedom and independence unavailable elsewhere in Indian society. Buddhist nuns delighted in the relative freedom of their order, where they largely ran their own affairs, were forbidden to do household chores, and devoted themselves wholly to the search of awakening, which many apparently achieved. A nun named Muta declared, I am free from the three crooked things, mortar, pestle, and my crooked husband. I am free from birth and death and all that dragged me back. Gradually, Buddhist teachings found an audience in India. Buddhism's egalitarian message appealed especially to lower caste groups and to women. The availability of his teachings in the local language of Pali rather than the classical Sanskrit, made it accessible, establishing monasteries and stupas containing relics of the Buddha on the site of neighboring shrines to earth spirits or near to sacred trees linked to new religions or traditions. The most dedicated followers joined monasteries, devoting their lives to spiritual practice and spreading the message amongst nearly everybody. State support during the reign of Ashoka likewise helped the new religion gain a foothold in India in a distinct tradition spread from Hinduism. As Buddhism spread within and beyond India, references in understanding soon emerged, particularly as to how nirvana could be achieved, or in the common Buddhist metaphor, how to cross the river to the far shore of enlightenment. The Buddha had taught a rather austere doctrine and intense self-effort undertook most actively by monks and nuns who withdrew from society to devote themselves fully to the quest. This early version of the new religion, known as Theravada, portrayed the Buddha as an immense wise teacher and model, but certainly not divine. It was more philosophical than religious, a set of practices rather than a set of beliefs. The gods, though never completely denied, played little role in assisting believers in their search for enlightenment. In short, individuals were on their own in crossing the river. Clearly, this was not for everyone. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the modified form of Buddhism, called Mahayana, had taken root in parts of India, and proclaiming that help was available for the strenuous voyage. Buddhist thinkers developed the idea of Bodhisattvas, spiritually developed people who postponed their own entry into nirvana to assist those who were still suffering. The Buddha himself became something of a god, and both earlier and future Buddhas were available to offer help. Elaborate description of these supernatural beings, together with various levels of heaven and hell, transformed Buddhism into a popular religion of salvation. Furthermore, religious merit leading to salvation might now be earned by acts of piety and devotion, such as contributing to the support of a monastery, and that merit might be transformed to others. This was the great vehicle, allowing far more people to make the voyage across the river. Hinduism as a religion of duty and devotion. Strangely enough, Buddhism as a distinct religion practice ultimately died out in the land of its birth as it was reincorporated into a broader Hindu tradition. But it spread widely and flourished, particularly in its Mahayana form in other parts of India. Buddhism declined in India, perhaps in part because of the mounting wealth of monasteries and the economic interests of their leader figures separated them from ordinary people. Competition from Islam after 1000 CE also played a role, but the most important reason for the waning of Buddhism in India was growing during the first millennium CE of a new kind of popular Hinduism, which the masses found more accessible than the elaborate sacrifices of the Brahmins or the philosophical speculation of the intellectuals. Expressed in the widely known epic poem known as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, this revived Hinduism indicated more clearly that actions in the world and the detaching performance of caste duties might also provide a path to liberation. It was perhaps a response to the challenge of Buddhism. In the much devoted Hindu text known as the Bhagavad Gita, the troubled warrior hero Arjuna is in anguish over the necessity of killing his kinsman as a decisive battle approaches. But he is assured by his charioteer, Lord Krishna, a incarnation of the god Vishnu, that performing this duty as a warrior and doing so selflessly without regard to consequences is an act of devotion that would lead to release from the shackles of repeated rebirth. This was not an invitation to militarism, but rather an affirmation that ordinary people, not just Brahmins, could also find spiritual fulfillment by selflessly performing the ordinary duties of their lives. The man who, casting off all desires, lives free from attachment, who is free from egoism and from feeling that this or that is mine, obtains tranquility. Withdrawal and asceticism were not the only way to moksha. Also becoming increasingly prominent was yet another religious path, the way of devotion to one or another of India's main gods and goddesses, beginning in South India and moving northward. This bhakti movement involved the immense adoration of and identification with a particular deity through song, prayers, and ritual. By far, the most popular deity was Vishnu, the protector and preserver of creation and associated with mercy and goodness, and Shiva, representing the divine in its destructive aspects. But many others also had their followers. This form of Hindu expression sometimes pushed against the rigid caste and gender hierarchies in India's society by inviting all to an adoration of the divine. After all, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita had declared that those who take shelter in me, though they may be lower birth, women, Vishas, and Shudras, can attain the supreme destination. The proliferation of gods and goddesses and of their bhakti cults occasioned very little friction or serious religion conflict. Hinduism, writes a leading scholar, is essentially tolerant and would rather assimilate than rigidly exclude. This capacity for assimilation extended to an already declining Buddhism, which for many people had become yet another cult worshiping yet another god. The Buddha, in fact, was incorporated into Hindu pantheon as the ninth incarnation of Vishnu. By 1000 CE, Buddhism had largely disappeared as a separate religion tradition within India. Thus, the constantly evolving and enormously varied South Asian religious tradition had been subsequently transformed. An early emphasis on ritual sacrifice gave way to that of philosophical speculation, devotional worship, and detached actions in the world. In the process, that tradition had generated Buddhism, which became the first of the great universal religions of world history, and then had absorbed the new religion back into the fold of an emerging popular Hinduism. Okay, and that is reading and completing section 2. Oh yeah, remember guys, if you've gotten this far in the reading, go ahead and like this video and share it and subscribe to the little channel there, guys. All right, let's have fun.